Our keynote speaker, Professor Gough, who joins us today from Leeds Beckett University. I'm sure it's probably safe to assume that quite a lot of you already know Brendan's work and have already come across some of his contributions to qualitative research. He's published quite widely on topics in relation to qualitative research, in relation to gender identities, health and well-being, and critical social psychology. And this includes two books, in fact, that are currently part of our lovely raffle, so I encourage you to go along and have a look. One on reflexivity and qualitative research, and one on critical social psychology. So we would like to welcome and to thank him this morning for coming and doing our keynote speech. And he will be talking today about reimagining qualitative research, examples and possibilities. So then we would welcome you to come up, and I will find the slideshow.
Thanks very much. It's lovely to be here. I think the book's wonderful. It's a real landmark text. I think it'll prove to be one of those books you look back on as something that's been very influential, because we're at a moment in qualitative research where we're starting to rethink mainstream methods, interviews, focus groups. We've been thinking critically about modes of analysis, as Ginny said, for years, but not so much qualitative data collection, and that's why this book is so exciting and important. So this is what I'm going to cover. I mean, the organisers here didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I could talk about anything, really. So I think they'll be reassured when they see this. It's about, again, being a bit critical of the kind of things that qualitative researchers do generally and have been doing for years, and thinking about the problems with mainstream qualitative methods. Then looking at interviews in particular. I'm not being totally critical of interviews. I want to say that the way interviews are done often is quite banal and quite tedious. But you can do interviews in a very interesting way, or very interesting ways, using different modalities and possibilities. Then to move beyond interviews and think about the other options for qualitative data collection, and I'll give some examples. But I'm going to focus mostly on online data collection, because that's what I've been doing with colleagues and students for years, and I'm really enjoying it. And the example I'm going to focus on, just to finish off, is some recent work looking at how men talk about infertility to each other online. So just to give you a more elongated example of the type of data that you can get from online sources and what you can do with it. I'll finish with a few issues to reflect on around publication, around teaching this stuff, and actually how to write it up and present it. So I'll try and keep the time. We've got about 45 minutes. Now I'm going to start off with the really naff thing of quoting myself, which is, probably narcissistic, but instead of like just reframing it, I'm just going to give the quote from a recent paper that I've done with Antonia Lyons. And the journal this comes from is a special issue on the future of qualitative research. So the journal is called, I can't remember, Integrated Behavioural Science or something like that. But what I'm saying here is that, beyond specialist qualitative methods journals, mainstream psychology and sociology and other journals, the type of qualitative research that they accept and publish is very narrow, and it is interviews plus IPA, or interviews plus thematic analysis, or sometimes focus groups. And in psychology journals at least, often the research is uncritical. It kind of complements rather than challenges mainstream qualitative, mainstream psychological research and theory often. And quite often, I mean, the journal I'm associated with, Qualitative Research in Psychology, we get loads of submissions which are just straightforward empirical reports using interviews or focus groups and an established form of analysis. And often they are implicitly or explicitly realist. In other words, assuming that interview or focus group accounts map on to experience in an unproblematic way. It's the type of thing that students do often, and you have to really work with them to, challenge that. And it is only the specialist qualitative journals, QRP. There's an APA journal now called Qualitative Psychology, which encourage more experimentation. And I want to reclaim that word, experiment, for qualitative research. I mean, it's something we should be using. And it's in these places only, really, where you get reports of alternative forms of qualitative research. Okay, on to interviews. There's just so many studies and publications where interviews used to generate themes, and after a while, when you've seen thousands of them, it gets a bit tedious. So for that reason alone, it's worth thinking differently. There's a nice phrase that Sven Brinkman has borrowed from sociology, from Ritzer, called McDonaldization, because what we have at the minute is mainstream qualitative research being kind of conducted according to a recipe or set field of instructions, as if it can be replicated, like quantitative research. And Brinkman's paper is lovely. He's at the forefront of thinking, I think, in theory around qualitative research. And I've asked him to do a paper for the journal, so that should be coming out soon. And he's arguing, tapping into this slow movement, slow academia, slow food, and so on. We should be slowing down when we do qualitative research and doing it properly, rather than speeding up in the neoliberal academic context that we're in. Although that's difficult because we have to perform and produce, so there's a tension. And of course, part of the reason for doing, say, online methods is because of efficiency and saving time and not having to do a laborious ethics process, a recruitment process, and so on. So there are little tensions there. And this is a very well established critique now, Potter and Hepburn, which we published 10 years ago. One of the points they make is that when people do interviews, unwittingly they flood the interview agenda with their own concepts and presuppositions, and that's not really recognised often or followed through. Okay, so really, when I talk about mainstream qualitative research, it's kind of qualitative research which is done with a technical or pragmatic or quasi-positivist kind of flavour, which is targeting mainstream psychology or social science journals. But you can do interviews differently, and lots of people over the past 10 years or so have been rethinking the interview and doing different things with it. And a large part of that has been incorporating visual dimensions in different shapes and forms. So there's a nice study by Cassandra Phoenix. She said she was coming, so I better get this right. Where she, her topic was older bodybuilders. So she did an interview with each member of the sample, then asked them to take 12 photos, which say this is me and 12 this is not me, and then bring them back in for a second interview and to base the interview around that. And the analysis involved analysing the participants' accounts of their photographs and more generally, but also analysing the photos themselves. Now, visual analysis is tricky, I think. It's hard not to be accused of being subjective, but there are guidelines and references that you can use. I've kind of shied away from it. too difficult. And so what she came up with, some interesting things around the body self as being healthy. So some of the photographs are about like the healthy food that they bought, and some were about very specifically performance, about kind of the protein products you can get for muscle growth and so on. And some are about the relationships to spaces and people, like the gym and fellow gym users and so on. So that's just one snapshot, pardon the pun, of a photo-informed interview study. You can use drawing. So this is an example from Gilman, 2004. And so what she did was an interview with people to talk about their experiences of heart disease, and another one was menopause. And then at the end of the interview, she asked participants to actually draw what the disease meant to them. And then afterwards she got them to talk about it and then analysed their accounts and the actual drawings. Another one with Jonathan Smith and colleagues, an IPA study. In contrast to the previous example, they got their participants to paint what their pain felt like to them before the interview took place. So the interview was then based around, at least initially, the paintings that they produced. And the themes that they come out with at the end were very much focused on the visual. So pain is an object, sinister, violent, punitive, the colour of pain, red, burning, black and brooding, and so on. So really interesting material which can inform the analysis very heavily. And another example is actually using objects and materials during an interview. So this is from a paper by Sheridan and Chamberlain. With the assistance of material objects, talk can become part of a multi-dimensional, multi-sensorial mode of representation and expression. So not just visual, but tangible, tactile as well. So they did a project on weight loss, and they invited participants to bring in whatever was relevant, including photographs, journals and diaries, old clothes, things like that. And what they conclude is that these kind of objects or paraphernalia can reinforce the story that's being told. It can develop or elaborate the story in a, more specifically, but it can also prompt different stories to emerge. So if you hadn't used the objects, you'd be stuck with one or two key narratives, but if you introduce these objects and materials which have significance to the person, they can actually bring up other things that wouldn't otherwise have been produced in a standard interview. Another thing you can do with interviews is go outside. You don't have to sit in a room. You can be mobile. One of my PhD students at the minute, her work is on wilderness therapy. Don't ask me about that. I don't know anything about it, right? I'm the second supervisor. So quite recently what she did was she got a group of participants with two facilitators out into the countryside, and it's kind of, her version is like Eastern informed wilderness therapy. It's a very specific mode, and they did various meditation type exercises in nature, and she was observing, taking notes and talking to them during this whole experience. They were taking diaries and photographs as well. She's going to interview them soon, where they can bring their photographs and diary entries and talk through that process as well. So, the interview experience is deepened and stimulated by these kind of artifacts which have personal meaning to the participants. But you can imagine if you're interested in space or you come from a geography type discipline, walking interviews in communities or places of significance would add another dimension. And of course, interviews can be digital these days, and increasingly that's what we're doing as researchers. There's a nice paper by Adam Jarrett, Liz Peel and Rachel Shaw, which we published a few years ago, which is a nice introduction to this type of online interviewing. Okay, beyond interviews, this is what we're looking for in qualitative journals. We don't want standard empirical reports. We want something interesting methodologically. That's why we turn down a lot of papers. We want them to say something a little bit different, like a twist on an established method, or saying something a bit new. So in our aims for QRP, exploring and expanding the territory of qualitative research. In the APA journal, something similar, innovative, theoretical advances. So this is the language that we use. And in QRP we've published special issues on visual methods, for example, and there are books on visual methods. We've published a special issue on online methods quite recently, and other methods beyond the standard ones are also out there. I think qualitative questionnaires, I'm starting to look at these more and more. In our first ever issue of QRP, we published a qualitative questionnaire study by Torianne Wilkinson, and this is on women's body hair removal. And the reason they used a qualitative questionnaire was because they wanted to get a sense of what the norms were around this practice. They weren't interested in experience or going deep. It was about a broad sense of the kind of norms which were informing body hair removal practices. And a large sample, that's massive by qualitative terms, right? So it's quite appealing in itself, because don't know about you, but you can't break away completely from the way we've been conditioned by mainstream psychology. And some of the norms that they come out with by doing an analysis across all these questionnaires, the norms are around body hair removal is linked to attractiveness, smoothness, being clean and tidy. There's almost a moral dimension, and obviously very gendered, kind of contemporary femininity, post-feminist notion of femininity. So very interesting stuff, and and I know Jenny and colleagues have used qualitative questionnaires and since then, and it's something that's becoming more attractive, I think. And we can go to our quantitative colleagues and say, look at my sample size. And one of my PhD students at the minute is looking at men and anxiety, and I've convinced her to do a questionnaire, a qualitative questionnaire, and we've included women because too much men's health and masculinity research only focuses on men and then presumes that this is the way men do stuff, right? But we want to compare how men and women talk about experiences of anxiety to actually see if there are any differences, not presume that there are differences. So looking at the kind of sources of anxiety that men and women describe, key examples and experiences, and how they deal with it, what are the methods they use, if any, because the stereotype is that men don't seek help, right? So we just got that data at the minute, and we'll be looking at it. Moving online, I'm using the word content in scare quotes. One of my favourite comedians, Stuart Lee, has got a new show called Content Provider, which is, says it all, really. So, as I say, this is something I've been attracted to for years. And it was my students who pushed, because I'm kind of old school, right? But my young students have pushed me into this domain. And the more I do it, the more I like it. So you've got data which is out there already. Okay, you don't have to recruit people, recruit ethics in a big way. Although you do have to be careful how you search and to find a data set which you can convince others is valid and meaningful. It's often naturalistic stuff, so people blogging or talking to each other, using their own language, unconstrained or uninfluenced by researcher presence. you can often get data which would be difficult or impossible to get otherwise through mainstream methods. It might be difficult to recruit some groups to interview or focus groups around sensitive topics, but people are online talking to their heart's content about all sorts of vulnerabilities. And you can get a wide sample and a very diverse sample as well. Although it's hard to pin down the demographics often, so that's an issue. So people are online making meaning on a variety of topics of interest to psychologists and social scientists, so why not use this? And as Jenny was saying earlier, it can be very efficient. There's no data collection, it's data selection, really searching and selection. Transcription you don't really have to do often, and it's a very light ethics process in most cases. So what's not to like? There's a nice paper on looking at blogs from a qualitative research standpoint. So if you're interested, a good place to start is Hookway, entering the blogosphere, which sets out some parameters for doing this type of research. In my field, there's work on inclusive masculinity, like Eric Anderson, controversial figure, you could say. One of his theses is that young men, especially these days, young heterosexual men, are more inclusive than previous generations of young men, in that they're less homophobic and they're more touchy-feely with each other, right? And one of his studies has looked at YouTubers. I've got a 14-year-old son who's into people like this. Dan is not on fire. The young people in the audience might have heard of this person. So Dan and Phil. So my son went to see these guys live. Thankfully he chose his mother to go with him. I got to see Ollie Murs with my daughter. I think I did best out of that. So he looked at the vlogs and analysed those, and did one interview with one of the guys. So this is his conclusion. These guys are not sporty, macho, or even concerned with being perceived as heterosexual. They present a softer masculinity, eschewing homophobia, misogyny, and so on, compared to previous generations. Now, if you've been reading the news in the past few months, past few years even, you know that his sample is often male university students. Well, there's a problem with sexism and sexual harassment on campus, right? So it doesn't kind of sit well with some of the other evidence that's coming out, so it's a kind of a complex and contradictory area, and his thesis is definitely overstated, but don't get me started on that here. But the point being that blogs and vlogs are really rich sources of data for qualitative researchers. Also, I've got a student looking at this website at the minute, Men Get Eating Disorders Too, because what they have on that website is a range, it's 20-odd personal stories that young men who suffer from eating disorders have posted on that website. So it's 25 little stories that a student can get to grips with and analyse, and it's a really interesting topic as well because it's such a feminised area, diet and eating disorders generally. So she's a good student. I hope she's going to do a good job on that. It's I don't have time to go on and show you the stories, but they're really interesting and rich, and you might not get that. These guys coming to do an interview with you, or they might not say some of the things that they're saying online, because they're anonymous, obviously. So lots of possibilities. Social media. Now, disclaimer: I don't know much about social media. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or anything, right? But some of my students are interested, active in these areas. And one recent one looked at, in contrast to Anderson's stuff, lad culture at university on Facebook, because I think every university has a Facebook confessions site, and it's often populated by young men talking about sexual conquest and so on. It's horrible stuff, actually, right? And she looked at 12 confessions on a university Facebook site, and it's all that traditional stuff about objectifying young women. The kind of language is very problematic, very appearance shaming and so on. So this undermines Anderson's thesis that young men are softer and more in touch with their emotions and less traditional than other generations. But very rich data, and I don't want to put up too many quotes there because it is horrible stuff. Antonia Lyons, one of my colleagues in New Zealand, has done a really lovely study with colleagues which was nationally funded on young people's drinking cultures and the way they post images online of their drinking experiences. She sent me some slides. Now, I don't know the study in depth, so I just wanted to plug it. And part of the context here is that when you look at the photographs and images that young people put up, it's all very positive. It's all linked to very positive stories of nights out and having fun and so on. And drinking heavily seems to be an identity which is very positively valued at university. So this culture of intoxication is normalized, and it encourages and promotes this heavy drinking among young people and possibly some alcohol-related problems. But a lot of the research in this area has been very mainstream quantitative, and what Antonia and colleagues wanted to do was just interrogate this stuff a bit more. Do qualitative research, in other words. Why do people post this material? What meanings do they derive from what they're posting? So she did focus groups or friendship groups with a very ethnically diverse group of young people. Pacifica is people from some of the Pacific Islands, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but that's kind of a gender category, which means, let me get this right, I think people who were born male but have a spirit which is female. But you can look that up if you want. Individual interviews, and this is where this complements the friendship group data in that every individual was going through their Facebook posts and images and talking through those in the interview. And you might get some data there that you wouldn't get from the focus group situation. And they also looked at the online sites, which they derived mostly from the participants, and then analysed those, in a complementary way. And what they found was that despite the very positive images and posts that were put up online, when they talked through it, especially in the individual interviews, they told stories about accidents, violence, injury, conflicts, crying, and so on. So beyond the surface, there was a lot more going on, a lot more complexity to the nights out and the stories that were told. But they've published various papers from that study, so if you're interested. Now, what I've been doing mostly with colleagues and students is looking at online support forums, and I know David Giles is going to talk about this in depth later. There's a nice paper by Adam Giles in a special issue on online methods that we published last year, if you're interested for a starting point. And what I've been doing with students and colleagues is looking at masculinity online and in various feminized contexts. So weight loss, cosmetic use, emotions and mental health more generally. So I'm interested in how men construct and negotiate masculinity in domains which have been traditionally populated and dominated by women and feminized notions. And the example I'm going to present this morning, just some slides on this. One mic per time. Yeah, okay. Is around men talking about infertility. And I've been doing this work with a researcher in the Centre for Men's Health at Leeds Beckett, where I work, and looking at the ways in which men look for help, how they construct that, the way they talk about it, also how they do emotion with peers online. Because infertility obviously will provoke very strong emotions. So how's that framed and managed by men? And how does peer support work for men? Because men aren't supposed to seek help traditionally, or even admit that they've got a problem. But online, they're talking away to other men like it's not a problem. Now, in reproductive medicine generally, traditionally at least, men are on the margins, right? Now, it's understandable that services should focus mainly on women, but I think men have been so far on the periphery as to that it affects not only men but the partners and the family. So if we bring men into the equation a bit more, being careful about it, then everyone could benefit. But there's hardly any research. All the research has been on women mainly, or couples, or in clinical contexts. We don't know how men themselves talk about things like infertility, or how they talk to other men about it, which is why online support forums are a goldmine for this type of data. So we found this this forum on a website for infertility charity, and it was men only, and we were open-minded about what to include. So we ended up looking at 13 threads, 415 posts from 20 main contributors, just to give you some idea of the context. Looking at emotions and help-seeking broadly. So we've got a couple of papers. One's on emotions and one's on help-seeking. So the first one on emotions. What we saw was that the men talked a lot about emotions, which is contrary again to this stereotype of men being emotionally repressed or inarticulate. And this emotional roller coaster was a theme they kept coming back to. Just one thing after another, ups and downs, highs and lows, struggles. So this was a phrase, and similar phrases were used to describe their emotions. And related to that, infertility was described in terms of being tyrannical, uncertainty, being in limbo, really difficult, not knowing what's going to happen, life being on hold. So these types of themes and metaphors. And linked to that, almost a paranoia, a world of doubt and thinking that infertility is always there and never going to let go. It robs so much of the joy every couple in the world should have. So feeling out on a limb, kind of marginalised, at a distance, removed from what happens normally. So lots of distress coming through. On the plus side, the men seem to benefit from talking online and getting support from other men. I'm really glad I found a forum for guys on this rocky road. Endless forums for women, but nothing for men. I've been feeling pretty down about the whole thing. Really wanted to find somewhere to chat with other people. And you end up feeling like there isn't anyone you can talk to. So this online space is presented as a really valuable resource where men can get help and advice. And I do need to talk with people who are going through what I am at the moment, and looking for responses, actively seeking advice and support. Now, obviously the context of the online forum is important, being anonymous in particular, I'm quite a private person. You might laugh because I'm telling you all my thoughts on my story on here, but it's anonymous. Okay, so it's a safe environment for a lot of men. The good thing about the forum is that it's totally anonymous. People don't know who you are, they just understand the pain you're going through and want to help. Thanks for your private message, I do appreciate it, although on this occasion I'm not going to respond, since I do want to keep the anonymity which society allows. So, not wanting to go outside this online space, which is safe and comforting and very useful. But at the same time, the way they talk about help seeking and emotions often is a very pragmatic, well, you might say masculine way. It's not counselling or psychiatry, it's just getting it off your chest. Okay, so minimizing the kind of emotional or feminized side of things. I will not lie to you, it can be an extremely difficult time going through treatment, and especially the 2-week wait. But as long as you're there for each other and try to stay positive, then good things can happen. So this is giving advice to another person, and then the response, your advice is sound, which is a bit understated, isn't it? You can imagine different responses there. Oh, thanks very much, that's wonderful. But no, it's kind of very muted, which is interesting. So that's why it's important to maybe compare these type of accounts with the way women are talking about this. That's something that we want to do. We've done a little bit of that already. Just continuing that theme, sometimes when they talk about emotions, it did seem kind of unprompted and not very policed, but other times there was a lot of caution. I know it can be hard to open up when it's something so private, but after all, we might be blokes, but we can still have the same thoughts and fears that ladies do. Interesting choice, ladies rather than women. We just deal with them in different ways. So there's kind of a discourse of gender difference coming through sometimes as well. I know that as men, again, masculinity is made relevant. You know, we're not imposing that category on the data. We have an inability to express our feelings, even though that's exactly what they're doing, right? But this side has really helped me to come to terms with all the things that are going off in my life. My point is the need for support for a girl, again, girl, ladies, you know, that's an interesting focus in itself. Is so much greater than the needs of a bloke. And we've kind of written about this the way women have more biological capital in this kind of reproductive medical context, which is part of the environment in which men are trying to make sense of things. So it stands to reason that everyone, including the bloke, will prioritise the feelings of the woman. They express more needs, so their needs are prioritised, this is women. Blokes find it hard to talk, and frankly usually don't want to. So it's so surprising that the ladies, who often have talking to spare, bit of criticism there, trying to speak for them and doing so to take the spotlight. So really interesting data about men reflecting on doing emotion, and the ways in which they should be doing it and the ways in which they shouldn't be doing it. Anyways, just some little conclusions from that. So men did construct infertility as distressing, using a range of emotions and metaphors and so on. To some extent they did undermine hegemonic notions of masculinity as emotionally repressed, or there is a technical term called I can pronounce that, lexithemic, right? And some of the American masculinity scholars use that term a lot, and they've probably got a scale for it, right? But what we also see, it's complicated data, is that the emotion talk is tempered by gender norms, sex difference discourse and so on. Particular ways of talking, so it's not emotion, it's stress, it's getting things off your chest, So for me, the notion of hybrid masculinity makes sense in that men, not just in this context, perhaps more generally, are caught between traditional notions of masculinity and more contemporary ones, and they're fluctuating between the two and trying to work out what works in particular contexts. So the contribution to the literature here is that there's hardly any research which elicits men's accounts around infertility. And if we can get men more involved and have more awareness of men's voices, then the woman, the partner, and the children can ultimately be in a better place. That's the argument. And what we're doing next, we've got a draft paper on lifestyle factors, how men talk about any adjustments they make to their lifestyle practices in the context of infertility. What we're finding is it's take a lot of vitamins and supplements and not really do that much to cut down on alcohol or change their diet, but that'll be coming up soon. And to look more closely at possible differences in the way that men and women might talk about and make sense of infertility. Not to presume that there will be differences, but just to look at that closely. And to do more around reducing stigma for men in this context. I know some of the papers we've done. We've just got a new one actually accepted on the impact of infertility on relationships from the point of view of the man, and that's Journal of Reproductive and Infant Psychology. But just to step away from that and step back to the main focus, as I say, I think the book is very timely because over the past 10 years or so, qualitative researchers in psychology and elsewhere have been experimenting with different ways of doing qualitative research. I don't mean kind of the wacky stuff that gets published in that American journal, Qualitative Inquiry, but experimenting with a small e, right? And it's nice that we have a book that brings it all together and that can then influence what gets done by the next generation. And I really hope and I expect it will reach a wide audience. So what we're seeing in this moment is that traditional qualitative methods are being reimagined, and in particular from my point of view, online methods are being showcased, and there's such a variety and flexibility to using qualitative research online. And of course, the society we live in, especially young people, is very digital, so it makes sense that we should be doing qualitative research digitally, right? Otherwise we'll just be cast away as old fogies, right? But there are some issues, especially if you've got visual and multimodal data. How do you get that published, right? Especially in mainstream journals. So that's something to think about. Where do you publish? Okay, because apart from some specialist qualitative methods journals who love this stuff, where else can you go, right? And then in terms of teaching students, we're already pushed for time in psychology curricula around qualitative methods. They just get very basic stuff at the minute. How are we going to fit in all this interesting stuff as well? I don't have any answers, right? I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you very much, and amazingly exactly on time. Thank you. So we have some time for some questions. If anybody has any, just stick your hand up.